Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son? Oh, where have you been, my darling young one? I've stumbled on the side of 12 misty mountains. I've walked and I've crawled on 6 crooked highways. I've stepped in the middle of 7 sad forests. I've been out in front of a dozen dead oceans. I've been 10,000 miles in the mouth of a graveyard. And it's a hard, it's a hard, it's a hard, and it's a hard, it's a hard rains are gonna fall. This is Pod Dylan, the show that celebrates the work of Bob Dylan, one song at a time. Proud member of the Fire and Water Podcast Network. I'm your host at FREEWHEELIN, Rob Kelly. And joining me to talk about one of the greatest Dylan songs of all time, maybe the single greatest Dylan song of all time, A Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall from 1963's The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, is the author of Hard Rain, Bob Dylan, Oral Cultures, and the Meaning of History, Alessandro Portelli. Hello, Alessandro.
Hi, good to talk to you.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really thoroughly enjoyed your book.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I am really excited to talk about it over the course of this episode. And of course, talking about this song, because this book is dedicated to just this song, basically, and its history, which is kind of an amazing artifact. And the idea to be able to kind of write a single, that a whole book could be written about a single song. But if any song in the Dylan canon is worthy of that, it's certainly this one. But before we get to the book and the history of the song and stuff, you get into this in your book a little bit, but I want to ask you, how did this all start? How did you become a fan of Bob in the first place?
Well, if you were 18 in 1960 and 1962, you could hardly avoid becoming a fan of Bob Dylan. In my case, I was a foreign exchange student in a high school in Los Angeles in 1960-61. And my foster family, as a matter of fact, I lived with a family in Westchester, LA. And for Christmas, after I got back home, sent me the Peter, Paul and Mary album, In the Wind, which of course is inspired and includes Blowing in the Wind. And things just got rolling from that point on. Basically, I had become, I was just beginning to become involved in some sort of politics, which I still am. But in a way, Dylan sounded like, like somebody that could accompany you critically in this process. He didn't just mouth slogans or anything. He just offered you a range of emotions and metaphors and feelings. So I guess he helped me grow up, basically.
When did you first hear A Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall? Did you hear it off of Freewheelin'? What was the context?
Well, of course, when I first bought Freewheeling, I was living in Italy, and from 61 on, and at that time, Dylan Records had no distribution over here, so that I didn't get the records in order. The first record I got was The Times Are Changing, because a friend of mine was going to the States for work, and I asked him, just get me anything by this guy Dylan, and he came back with that, and so. And I bought Freewheeling afterwards, and then Bob Dylan, the first album after that. And then from that point on, there was a distribution, and I was able to follow it. So this must have been around late 63, basically. And actually, I remember buying it on the way back from a demonstration in the center of Rome, and there was a march of the homeless in the central room, and I was recording those. And on the way, at the end of the march, on the way home, I stopped by a record store, and here it was. So I came home that night with some of the greatest recordings I ever made in the field, and of course, my favorite album. That was a very memorable day.
Was that the day that you relate in the book about where you put Dylan on, and was it your father who comes barreling in and says, turn that awful thing off?
That was before. That was before. Because, when I got the Times They Were Changing album, I put it on the wrong side, and the first thing that came on was Only a Pawn in Their Game. And I mean, if you haven't heard Dylan's voice before, I mean, it's tough. And and of course, I had been playing Joan Baez, Peter, Paul and Mary, and I was still living at home, and that was accepted. Dylan's voice just tore through all that. Mm-hmm. And, I'm really grateful to my father for showing this very clearly. This was something else. No, I played Hard Rain's Gonna Fall on the radio a year later because, well, basically, I was one of the very few people, probably the only person I know of that was collecting American folk records at that time. And I had this brother of a friend who had a radio program, a radio show on, the flagship station of States Radio. And he had never heard that kind of music. So he said, why don't you come on my show and play one record a week? So the first record I played was Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. And
it struck you, that particular song struck you right off the bat? Like you knew that one, even though you loved everything you were hearing, that one was really like, wow, this is a whole other level.
And also, back in, I think 56, 57, I had bought Harry Belafonte's 45 of Lord Randall. Mm-hmm. And I immediately recognized the connection there between, yes, the song struck me because it strikes, and it would strike anyone.
Sure.
And but there was this further dimension. I was becoming involved in all the folk revival movement. I was doing field work in my own environment, and I had just discovered that there was an Italian folk song. There was just a parallel to Lord Randall, that it also began, "Where have you been, my darling son?" Mm-hmm. And it was a dialogue between the mother and the son, just like Hard Rain. So in fact, these were two distinct processes. On the one hand, I was obsessed by the popular ballad, by the folk song, because, well, the song is, the young man leaves home and goes out hunting, and he's poisoned by his true love, quote unquote. And he comes home, and his mother asks him to make his will, and he makes a will, and he leaves symbolic gifts to each member of the family, marking their social role and their position in society and in the family. And what fascinated me was, on the one hand, the question, what is the meaning of the fact that his true love poisons him, on the one hand, and that feeds into the meaning of history phrase in my title. On the other hand, I began to compare versions of the song, noticing how they, a folk song is a folk song because it keeps changing. It's a living organism. And so when I recorded the Italian version of Lord Randall in a neighborhood here in Rome, a working class neighborhood in Rome, well, the will that he makes was totally different from the will that he makes in northern Italian versions, had nothing to do with the will in North Carolina or Scotland. Mm-hmm. And so you have sort of a social history of the family. So I was, on the one hand, absolutely excited about the Dylan song and obsessed by the folk song. Incidentally, when I first began to work as an assistant to the assistant professor in the English departments in Rome, we had a seminar on 20th century American poetry, and I presented and discussed Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. So I was following it both from the folklore history aspect and from the literary poetic aspect.
Well, that leads in perfectly to something I would ask you about. It was that I was curious about how this song kind of traveled with you through your life. Obviously, it's one of his earliest songs, so it's almost just under 60 years old at this point, and in terms of its composition and its recording. Yeah, and so was when he would do live versions of it, and we'll talk about that in a little, how many times he's done it live. Like, would you go and sort of particularly try and seek those out to say, oh, how is the song kind of moving forward with me in time through my life? Did it change in your mind what it was about, again, to you as you went through life, as you're in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and he's doing it in different guises?
I'm actually 80. Anyway, one thing the song does, he basically, Bob Dylan said, refused the idea that the song was about something, which means it's about most everything. My friend Alessandro Carrera, who's a great Dylanologist, says it's about the apocalypse, it's about the end of times, which it is, but it's also about history. And one of the things that the song has done is that it has responded to the different forms that the apocalypse has taken in history, like the nuclear holocaust in the 60s, but then it's become the theme song of the environmental movement.
Right.
Hard Rain, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Kentucky, and hard rain is the acid rain from bituminous coal. And then, and in fact, this is something that is not in the Italian version. The Italian version came before the English, and this is a chapter I added in the English version because I suddenly realized that the people who've crossed over dead oceans, who've walked across deserts, who stood in the mouths of graveyards, these are the migrants. These are the people who are crossing the border in across the wall or before they build the wall, or that are dying by the thousands in the Mediterranean, trying to reach the northern shore of the Mediterranean. And if you listen to the song with those people in mind, I mean, every image resonates. And after all, when Dylan finally announced that he was moving away from political engagement, from superficial, from visible political engagement, yet in his songs, Chimes of Freedom, he sings for the refugees on the unarmed road of flight. I mean, here they are. And that was 64. So what he's doing is the song has not changed its meaning, but widened, broadened the meaning
Mm-hmm.
as new crises, new apocalypses loomed on the horizon, and new hard rains were gonna fall.
Mm. I've always been struck with this song is that, I mean, and Dylan himself has talked about that he thought, as he saw it, every line or every couple of lines could be, as he said, a springboard to another song,
Yes.
because it's all so open ended. It's all this chain of imagery that doesn't seem to really connect up to anything in particular. And I think listening to it over again, all the bunch of versions that exist of it, listening to it again recently in preparation for this, it's on paper, it could be kind of a downer song because of what it's talking about. But there's something about, to me at least, how he, for this song, purposely leaves out any real interpretation of what he's describing that gives it that lift. Part of it is the vocal performance. And again, we'll talk about that when he recorded it. But part of it is that it's because it is so ill-defined that it leads you to kind of, I mean, a lot of this imagery is pretty nightmarish, but he doesn't draw any straight conclusions. And so it leaves it up to the listener to kind of decide these things for themselves. And to me, that's what helps keep it from being so down, because obviously it's about nuclear apocalypse, good Lord. But and a lot of people thought it was because it was released after the Cuban Missile Crisis, even though it was written before, and even performed it like hootenannies or whatever before. But to me, that's part of it, is that why it seems to work so well across all these years, because it allows the listener to lean in, it forces them to lean in and sort of define for themselves what any of these lines are. Now, when you listen to it, do you have any sense in a concrete way of what is happening, or is that not the case, and it doesn't matter your enjoyment of it?
Well, it comes and goes. Sometimes the images just jump to your mind. I mean, when he talks about a white man who walks a black dog, that's Abu Ghraib. It's actually happened. Well, in the end, what he says basically is, just like the folk song, he also makes a will, a final statement. I know my song well before I start thinking. And in a way, what it does is like the art, the song itself is the artist's message to mankind. And it's a warning. And somehow I keep making the connection with another song, which is which is very powerful, which is Pete Seeger's "If I Had a Hammer," and he says that rolled out that it talks about a warning, and he also says a way that rolled out a warning. So it's a warning. The rain is gonna fall. It hasn't fallen yet. It hasn't fallen yet. And you talk about the nuclear crisis. There's a line in Don DeLillo's Underworld when he talks about the nuclear threat. But then he says, well, after all, the bombers didn't leave the hangars. The bombs didn't fall. So the way he puts it in the song, it's gonna fall. There's no way out. On the other hand, and I've learned this from folk music, you never take a song out by itself separately. You always read it in the context of other songs, like in there are songs that are exactly the mirror image to Lord Randall. In this case, I mean, he writes this apocalyptic song in 1962. A year later, the times are changing. my favorite Dylan song, When the Ship Comes In. So um, I guess the whole point of the book is he stands at the crossroads between catastrophe and hope. Just as he stands at the crossroads between folk tradition and the postmodern vision, he's not a link in a chain. I'm quoting myself, but he's not a link. He's a link that connects many chains. So while I think the only other reason why, there are two other reasons why we cannot take Hard Rain as I don't receive it as a downer, which I do, but perhaps this is just me. To me, like a Rolling Stone, it's a sort of downer. But number one, except in both cases, because of the anger in the voice. He is not, he doesn't, he sees it, he feels it, but he resists, he fights it. And also, because if you think about it, a lot of the modernistic literary vision of history, I mean, for a number of strange reasons, I'm rereading Ulysses, and I just chanced on the famous passage where it says, "History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake." Okay, if you take all the great 20th century artists, Yeats, Joyce, Faulkner, Pirandello in Italy, Conrad, James, Eliot, they all have this vision of history as a nightmare, history as a tragedy. And most of them are ideologically very conservative, but their readers aren't, because one of the ways we read these books is that, well, the fact that their criticism of history and of the ways in which the world is shaped is so radical that that it really invites you to do something about it. You know, even though they say there's nothing we can do about it, yet, well, perhaps the sheer beauty in which this doom is announced contradicts it. So, as opposed to a lot of the progressive literature that I may agree with ideologically, but it's usually very weak in terms of always attempting to include an element of possibility, of hope, which means that the threat is not as bad as as we think it is. While Dylan says it's not as bad as you think, it's worse. so if you and also and again I'm quoting myself. He's not attempting to. The task that he takes upon himself is not to tell us how to get out of this situation. It's to tell us, what kind of desolation row we're living in, and then it's up to us. It's really up to us. So in this sense, yes, it is open.
Yeah.
It is open.
Now, you mentioned in your book, again, I'll mention the title again, Hard Rain, Bob Dylan, Oral Cultures and the Meaning of History. You say in the book, this is his greatest song. You think this is his greatest song, which again, that's a for anyone to kind of pick one song, it's a bold statement because the man's written so many. What can you explain that a little? Like, why do you think this one, if it is sort of a fool's errand to say one is the best because everyone feels differently, and it's like that. And Bob himself, who knows what he would say if you ever asked him that question. But why do you think, in your mind, like, again, as you say in the book, this is his as a songwriter, as a written song, not so much performed, greatest performance ever, but as a piece of songwriting, you think this is his greatest work, and why is that?
Well, it's hard to tell. As you probably noticed, I say it's I think it's his greatest song. Other people better qualified say no, it's number two. Number one is like a Rolling Stone, and I don't question it. But I also said that it's not my favorite song. My favorite song is when the ship
comes in, right?
because for one thing, it gives us hope. But I think it's because, to me, it's because of the connection with the folk ballad. It's because it really. This is perhaps too autobiographical, but it connects a number of it connects my life work on folklore and folk music and oral history to the historical time in which I grew up. So it's this because on the one hand you have Lord Randall, on the other hand you have Rimbaud, and you have French symbolist poetry. So but I think it's the fact that he stands upon these centuries, and one thing that I can't remember what. No, I think it was from Willens, it's pronounced. He has this very good book on Dylan, and he talks about how Dylan goes back in the 90s when his creative veins seemed to be flagging. What Dylan did was he went back to the folk songs.
Right.
He went back to the folk songs. He did 2 folk albums, and then he had this prodigious season of creative. And to me, it's like there's this Greek myth of the Titan Antheus that imbibed new strength every time he touched the earth. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, this is what it does. So, I mean, I'm a great admirer, say, of Leonard Cohen, and but what Dylan has that Leonard Cohen doesn't have as much is this connection with the centuries. Mm-hmm. Cohen does it through the Jewish tradition and so on, but in Dylan, you can feel that there are centuries that are speaking through him, but and yet his is a very individual, very different voice. He's not just a bard. He's I guess he's a poet. He's a poet that recognizes the tradition and changes it. Well, I guess this may be it.
I can only imagine people's reaction when this song comes out, and I mean the songs. I mean, obviously everyone knows it's a masterpiece of a record, but to have like the side one of Freewheelin' is Blowin' in the Wind and Go from the North Country, Masters of War, Down the Highway, Bob Dylan's Dream. And then this song closes side one, which has got to be one of the greatest sort of, I can only imagine, again, getting to it in 1963 and hearing that, and then have to just sort of sit there with it, with the record, just, the needle just kind of running over the grooves. And you're like, what did I just hear? Because even among the other brilliant songs on that album, just that side one alone, Hard Rain is like its own separate thing. It feels differently than the rest of them in terms of the imagery, and how it really, again, it seems to kind of come out of nowhere. And then, on side two, again, there's even more, other great songs, but there isn't anything even kind of close to it in its reach and its attempt. And again, no song comes out of nowhere. Bob obviously had this going on in his brain, and he was, as you mentioned, talk about that it's a a version of Lord Randall, this old folk song and other songs. But the fact that this thing seems so confident, and he seems throughout the performance to know exactly what he's trying to put across. Famously, this was recorded in one take for the Freewheelin' record, which again is amazing. The fact he can just get through such a lyrically dense song and not mess it up is amazing achievement by itself. But it really does seem to just sort of exist outside of its own time, and it is still, again, 60 years on, unique to his canon. I quoted the lines, and then they get the second verse is back with the, what did you see, my blue-eyed son? I saw a newborn baby with wild wolves all around it. I saw a highway of diamonds with nobody on it. I saw a black branch with blood that kept dripping. I saw a room full of men with their hammers a-bleeding. I saw a white ladder all covered with water. I saw 10,000 talkers whose tongues were all broken. I saw the guns and sharp swords in the hands of young children. And again, it's a hard. Again, except it's all kind of desolate, nightmarish imagery. But yet again, there's this sort of kaleidoscope feel to it that you're seeing little bits and pieces of things as the son is describing what they saw. And again, it does have that, it's scary, but it doesn't feel scary in the performance, the way it's put across to him. Now, what made you want to write a whole book about this? Like, what was the inspiration for that?
Well, two things about the Freewheeling. He had also composed "Let Me Die in My Footsteps."
Right. We just covered that on the show a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
And it was left out. And I think, again, if you take the two songs together, you see how he's standing again at the crossroads of different ways of, and also, there's one image from Revelations, as a matter of fact, I think, in Masters of War, where it says, in a pale afternoon, with a pale horse and its rider. So, but what sets Hard Rain apart is that all of the other songs are basically, realistic. Even Blowing in the Wind, Masters of War. Here, he just steps out of that approach, and all of the images that you just read, they have no immediate real life equivalent. Right. They're just it's a nightmare dream symbol, but we're moving on to another dimension of another kind of vision. I think this is what he does. Now the point is, why did I decide to write a whole book about it? Basically, I was forced. Well, what happened was, and as I mentioned in the book, I sort of drifted not completely away from Dylan, but not as deeply involved as I used to be in the 60s. So I never thought I would write anything about him. But what happened was, when he got the Nobel Prize, my publisher, with whom I had published my Bruce Springsteen book, he knew I had been interested in it. So he asked me to give a talk on Dylan and the Nobel Prize. And so I just went back to my old musings on the connection between Hadrain and Lord Randall, and I gave that talk, and he says, you had to write a book. and I said, forget it. I mean, how can I fill a book with just this? So what happens, and this goes back to the reading of the song. I was asked, and I did it, to edit an Italian edition of the selected novels of Toni Morrison, the other love of my life, and and the day it was really tough, but I did it. And the day I finally sent the file off to the publishers, I sat down and I started to write this book. It was just like, you know, after a race, you sort of loosen up your muscles or something. And I suddenly realized that there's one word that Dylan injects in the song that is in none of the original of the folk versions. My Blue-Eyed Song.
Right.
In none of the folk song versions is the song Blue-Eyed. And the reason I realized that this word was important because I had just finished writing an introduction, revising the translation, and writing the footnotes to The Bluest Eye. And I suddenly realized what the blue eye means. Incidentally, when Jimmy Cliff covers How Rains Are Gonna Fall, he says, my brown-eyed song. And when the Staple Singers cover How Rains Are Gonna Fall, they say, my wandering song. Because Black people do not have blue eyes. So that the song is about, it's not about white people, but it's about the two things. On the one hand, the entitlement and the expectations that come from having blue eyes, from being white, like me, like us. You know? So if you're white, you think you have some rights. If you're white, you're right. If you're brown, stick around. So, and you go out into the world expecting, and here's where Bob Dylan, the other song, Bob Dylan's Dream, is so important. He says, we thought our one road would never, we would all travel together on one road that would never shatter or split. 4 tracks later, the roads are 6 and they're all crooked. So, you have expectations, and then you go out, and this is a great theme in American literature, the theme of the young man, of the initiation of the innocent young man. And blue eyes are classically a symbol of innocence. Innocence he knows no evil. He goes out into the world and he discovers evil, just like the young man in Lord Randall goes out into the wilderness and discovers treason. So this is what both songs are about. And then I realized that it also resonated with another project that I worked on, which was an oral history of the student movement of the mass demonstrations that took place in Genoa in 2001 on the G8, around the G8 meeting. And there was a police riot and they were beaten up and the young man was killed. And I had interviews with some of my students who were there. And I said, I went to Genoa and I was wearing flowers in my hair and they beat me up. These blue-eyed. And of course, I noticed that all the photographs of the migrants from Africa or from Mexico stranded, in our case, on the Italian shores, they all have brown eyes. So in this sense, part of the reason why I finally ended up writing this book was, on the one hand, because I wanted to sort of relax after Toni Morrison. But then Toni Morrison led me back to it. And so this is another crucial theme in the song. The expectations that we have, and the frightening encounter, and of course, you think of Emerson's transparent eyeball, and but what to me is one of the greatest opening paragraphs in American literature, which is the Scarlet Letter, where he says, the founders of whatever utopia, no matter what dream of human happiness I'm coming from them, they had in mind, yet they always had to set apart part of the virgin ground for a cemetery and part of the virgin ground for a jail, which means, death and evil are always going to be with us. Mm. And then I realized, of course, that the graveyard is where hard rain begins, and the jail is where it ends. The home in the valley turns meets the devil. So it's really, we don't want to overdo the interpretation and everything, but in many ways, it's also a song about the limits of utopia. And I don't know, but not only Hawthorne was talking about America. So who knows, maybe it's also a song about the American dream. And because Blue-Eyed Son, of course, is intrinsically American.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard other versions, and I noticed that I like the Wandering Son, and it never really occurred to me that other singers were appropriating it for their own culture by changing out the Blue-Eyed Son. That makes a lot. Yeah, I've never even thought of it, but that makes makes complete sense. In the third verse, where he sings about, I heard the sound of a thunder had roared out a warning. I heard the roar of a wave that could drown the whole world. I heard 100 drummers whose hands were ablazing. I heard 10,000 whispering and nobody listening. I heard one person starve. I heard many people laugh. And I heard the song of a poet who died in the gutter. I heard the sound of a clown who cried in the alley. And it's hard. I always found that line about the song of a poet who died in the gutter as not about himself, but probably about some of his friends, at the very least, people that were artists who were struggling to survive and maybe hadn't survived at that point. I always feel like that one. See, anytime he's mentioning a poet, he talk about himself, and as he said in interviews, this song started out as a poem. Obviously, he learned very quickly. A poem was not how he wanted to convey it.
If you look at the whole verse is about silence, and it's about whispering and nobody listening.
Right.
The clown cried in the alley, and the poet that died in the gutter. Part of the tragedy is that those who pick up the warning, those who hear the warning, they speak, but nobody listens. It's again, we may overdo it and go back to Cassandra and the unheard prophet, but because one of the things that have in which the song has grown in my hearing is that I begin to realize that the apocalypse is not just out in the world.
Right.
It's in our souls, and in a way, it's already happened in that sense. We've already stopped listening to each other, and the other theme is innocence. A child beside a dead pony with the wild wolves around it. It's innocence, listening and being heard. So it's really about alienation, solitude, and you're right about the second side of freewheeling. Like one of Dylan's weakest songs, very political, Oxford Town. But he has one of the most fantastic lines in Talking World War III Blues, when he says, "I'll let you be in my dream if I can be
in yours." Yeah,
that is so powerful, because it connects. And again, it's of course it's a post-apocalypse world, and the apocalypse is loneliness, solitude, isolation.
I'm constantly amazed that he will have lines in his songs, and there's some here that obviously he cannot be referring to this particular thing, because this particular thing did not exist when he's referring to it. But when I hear the line about a roar of a wave that could drown the whole world, and then 10,000 whispering and nobody listening, I mean, to me, it's like that's social media nowadays. I mean, that's what that is.
He
It's
talks
this.
about it. He says that. On the other hand, a wave that could drown the whole world. It's happening.
Mm-hmm.
From North Pole is melting. It's happening. And Amitav Ghosh writes about it. It's a great book. But also, it has happened. Guns and sharp swords in the hands of young children. Again, innocence. Sierra Leone, the civil war in Sierra Leone, where 12-year-olds were using machetes to cut off people's limbs. Children. It's happening. So maybe this is one of the things that make it so powerful, because it's not about the children in Sierra Leone, which hadn't happened. It's not about my students in Genoa, which was 40 years later. But it tells you why this could happen. It tells you the kind of field of forces that 10 years later made it happen. So, and I think this is I mean, I'm absolutely persuaded that if we accept that the Nobel Prize means anything, which it may or may not, but if we do, I mean, I believe that he deserves it on the strength of this song. And I think, of course, Patti Smith made the right choice.
Right, yeah. Of all the songs to be performed at that ceremony, they performed this. She chose to perform this. I do wonder if Bob had any input on that at all. We'll never know, probably.
No.
But it's remarkable. Again, this is the song that they chose to perform. I always found it again interesting the final verse, which is almost double the length of all the other verses.
Yeah.
And that the imagery keeps piling up, and I walk to the depths of the deepest dark forest, where the people are many and their hands are all empty, where the pellets of poison are flooding their waters, where their home in the valley meets the damp, dirty prison, where the executioner's face is always well hidden.
If you look at the pictures of the police attacking the students in Genoa, that's exactly it. 1,000 drummers with their hammers blazing, and their faces will hit them. It's exactly that image. It's
amazing.
uncanny.
And then he says, where hunger is ugly, where souls are forgot, where black is the color and none is the number. And then I love the switch up as we get to the end of the song. And I'll tell it and think it and speak it and breathe it and reflect from the mountain so all souls can see it. And again, I love we're all of a sudden we're listening to someone talking to their child, and this child is reciting this imagery. And then we're back to the narrator who is now taking center stage. And I'll tell it and think it and speak it and breathe it and reflect it from the mountain so all souls can see it. And then I'll stand on the ocean until I start sinking, but I'll know my song well before I start singing. And to me, it's that those last couple of lines, again, that give this song kind of an uplift that you wouldn't imagine from all the imagery you've seen to this point, because it's the utter confidence of the singer, in this case, Bob Dylan, the 22-year-old Bob Dylan, 22-year-old Bob Dylan, having the confidence to say this kind of thing. But I'll know my song well before I start singing, which is something that, right now we're living through this whole idea of people who just say stuff, they have no idea what they're talking about, but they just blurt it out and, leaving the world to kind of deal with it. But I always found that to be like in so many ways, almost like his mission statement. Not that Bob Dylan really has one, but if he did, like, I'll know my song well before I start singing. I mean, it's like, I've thought about this, I've ruminated, and here's what I have to say, but I'm not a dilettante about this. This is a hard-won wisdom, again, at 22. But nevertheless, it's, as you mentioned, it's all the history up until that point that he has internalized. Now he's putting out, and again, as you mentioned in the subtitle of your book, oral cultures, doing it in the oral tradition of listen to what I have. This isn't just a poem I'm writing down, and you're going to read it. You're going to listen to me sing it.
I'm just a second. Well, there are a number of things. Number one, it's suddenly, we've been talking about the hard rain hasn't fallen yet, but the oceans are already dead. And the pellets of poisons are already flooding our waters. So it's already happened. And from the vantage point of 2022, yes, it's already happened. But essentially, he says, I'll reflect from the mud. Again, here's what you have in the background. Of course, you have a spiritual, go tell it on the mountain.
Right.
And it's the announcement. However, he knows his song well before he starts singing, but he will also start sinking. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing in the song that says that it will not sing. So, on the other hand, if the song is the equivalent to Lord Randall's will, he must die in order to make a will. And the basic difference between this song and Lord Randall is that after the hero dies in Lord Randall, his family, his society go on. After the hero dies, well, we have no guarantee that the world will go on in this song. It will go on in other songs, in Times That Are Changing, in When the Ship Comes In, not specifically in this song. And the other very cryptic line that fascinates me is the home in the valley meets the damp, dirty prison. What does it mean? Mm-hmm. Does it mean, that the home in the valley is not far from the prison, or that the home in the valley evolves into the damp, dirty prison, or that the home in the valley is already a prison?
Right, it's become the damp, dirty prison, yeah.
So that is a that again is a very powerful line, very powerful because it's cryptic, because it really leads you to ask, what's my home like?
Now this song, as anyone would expect, has been, a staple of his career. Performance wise, it's been performed 457 times. It's not, for a lot of other artists, that's a lot, but when you're talking about 60 years of performances, it's really not that many. It was last performed actually in 2017. So it's been getting, that was 5 years ago, but that's in Dylan terms, that's a recent vintage. Now, when it was done in the early 60s and then put away for basically the late 60s and then brought back in the early 70s. And then when it got brought out for the Rolling Thunder Review, it became like a rave up tempo, and which is, you would not think this is the kind of song that would work in that context. But again, there's versions of it you can hear on various bootleg series. What do you think of, what have you thought of some of these versions that you've heard that are drastically different from how you initially interpreted it? I mean, does it work for you as like a rock and roll rave up? I mean, good Lord, on one version on the bootleg series, there's like a guitar solo in the middle of it, which feels strange for a song like this, but yet they're rocking out on it.
Well, well, I like some of these versions. I haven't heard them all, and it's really not the direction in which I've been working. But
right.
Of course, I heard a lot of them. Some I like, and I've seen Rolling Thunder Review, of course. And I had a hard time recognizing the song in the review. And some of those versions are powerful. Others are, you have a feeling that, well, in one of the things that I've worked on in my as a professor of literature has been the relationship between sound and writing in American literature. And let's remember, phonography is the writing of sound. So literally. So Dylan, again, is at this crossroads between something which is very clearly written. I mean, we also have written typescripts of the song that claim to be the original. And it's also set immutably forever in the record. On the other hand, and this is a theme in American literature, the fact that something is written once and for all, well, it's deadly. It doesn't move anymore. So throughout American literature, you have authors. William Faulkner is a case, but is probably the one that does it most consciously, which they try to tell the reader, look, this is not really a text. This is a performance.
Right.
This is happening, or, I mean, Whitman famously, whoever touches this touches a man. This is no book. It is a book, but so Dylan is in that tradition. The fact that he refuses to accept the fact that once you've recorded a song, that's the shape of that song. In order to keep it alive, you have to keep changing it. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the reasons why, and also, I mean, as he changes, he can't repeat himself. He can't sing. He's no longer the Bob Dylan of 1962. He can't sing that song the way he did in 1962. So there are two reasons. Number one, the fact that performing a song is a relationship with a text, and you need to change. And because you change, it's memory. Because you change, then the song needs to change with you. And on the other hand, because if you keep repeating the way in which it's recorded, then then it's not alive. So
Right. Yeah.
at some points I had I had this feeling, and I said this in the book, that he was actually killing the song to keep it alive. He played the song, he made it unrecognizable, he made it in order to keep it alive. One thing he never changes one line from the text, which he does very often.
Yeah, for a song seemingly so open to doing that, he's kept it. It's he sings he sings them the way he sung them in 1963.
Yeah, this one that I know of, he does the most outlandish things with the music, but not with the text, not with the story.
Yeah. Before we wrap up here, there were a couple other versions that I wanted to mention because it underscores what you just said about having to keep it alive, to let it change over time. He performed this at the Great Music Experience in 1994, which was only did 3 songs, and this was one of them, where he was backed by a 90-piece orchestra, which seems, Bob Dylan performing with an orchestra seems almost antithetical to how he goes about it, because he's not big on fixed arrangements and following the arrangements. He sort of takes the lead and the band follows behind, but obviously you can't do that if it's part of a symphony orchestra. And yet he did the song there, and again, and it works within its own context. There's another version that I don't even remember how I got this version. It's just in my iTunes collection of Bob Dylan songs, where he re-recorded it, a studio version. He re-recorded it for the Expo Zaragoza 2008 World's Fair, which was in June 8, 2008, which was, and it was highlighting the theme of water and sustainable development. And he sings a kind of, again, up-tempo version of it. And at the end of the song, he himself comes in with a little vocal track where he says he's proud to be he's proud to be part of the mission to make water safe and clean for every human being living in this world. And you can count on one hand, maybe even like 2 fingers, the amount of songs he's ever performed where he himself kind of drops in on it and has like a kind of commentary over it. And so it's very unique. And I thought it was instructive that this is the song that he chose to do a new studio version and kind of donate to this cause.
And in fact, the song became the theme song for the Copenhagen Environment International
meeting.
Did
it really? Oh, wow. Yeah. I didn't know that.
Okay. Of course, it was a failure. The meeting itself was a failure, but the song was there. So, one thing about Dylan that always fascinated me is how, take Bruce Springsteen. A Bruce Springsteen concert is a ceremony of community, of togetherness. Any Bob Dylan concert is a ceremony of rejection. Why are you here? What do you want?
That'd be a great title for one of his live albums, Ceremony of Rejection.
and much as I love Bruce Springsteen, and I haven't missed any of his concerts when he came to this country, and in the U.S. too, when I could. But there's a sense of challenging me in Dylan's attitude that you need a ceremony to feel good about yourself and about your world, and Springsteen is that, with all the critical protest and everything in it, but we're together. But you also need ceremonies to remind you that the world is gone awry. And I think ultimately, in terms of the power of poetry and the power of memory, a ceremony that doesn't make you feel good is probably more productive in the long run.
Mm.
Yeah.
I got to say, this is like just a sidetrack, but when I was getting into Bob for the first time and I was gobbling up all of his records, and I really didn't have a context for them, like when they were released, what order, because this was pre-internet, so I couldn't really look this stuff up. And I remember getting the 1976 live album Hard Rain, which the only time they've even, in Dylan's career has a live album or any subsequent album been sort of named after a song in his catalog. But I was so confused that there is no version of A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall on that record. And I think it was Columbia Records being a little cheeky because it was those concerts and when they were recorded that rain started falling on the band and there was some technical problems and somebody even got like a minorly electrocuted because of all the equipment there. But I remember just getting the record and flipping it over and looking at the songs and going, wait a minute, why is Hard Rain's not on the record? I learned, soon after, well, that's Bob. That's kind of what it is. And of course,
someone somewhere has an article about Dylan's fascination with floods.
Yes, right. Yes, down in the flood and crash on the levee. Yeah.
Beginning with Bessie Smith, with a song about the 1927 flood. So maybe that's what he had in mind there.
Maybe if it keeps on raining, the levee's going to break. Now it was this song that when Allen Ginsberg heard it, said he wept because he knew in that moment that the torch had been passed from one generation to another, which again is a remarkable quote to have about Bob Dylan and about this song in particular. And it's been covered extensively by lots of different artists, and it's to use a term that I think Bob himself might appreciate because we know Bob loves to work in metal, loves to do iron work. This song, this is one of the songs to me that feels like it's the basic structure to which his entire legend is built upon. Everyone knows Blowin' in the Wind. Everyone knows that times they are changing, like a Rolling Stone, like you mentioned. But then there were songs like this that maybe the average person doesn't know. Dylan fans certainly know. Songwriters certainly know. Music critics certainly know. But this is like a steel girder in the giant edifice that is the sort of Bob Dylan career because the song is so amazing. And it appeared on Greatest Hits Volume 2, even though it was never a hit. It was never a single, of course, because it's too long. There's even a quote from that where Pete Seeger at some hootenanny, he said, all the folk singers, you get 3 songs because everybody's got 10 minutes and that's it. And Bob was like, well, what do I do if I have one song that's 10 minutes? Which was this song. But I mean, the fact that it appears on Greatest Hits Volume 2, even though this was not a hit in any way, says, Dylan himself recognized, okay, this is a big, important song. And I'm going to put it on Greatest Hits Volume 2, even though, it doesn't match that sort of misnomer. So it's, as we're kind of wrapping up here, I do want to ask you a little bit more again about the book. Did you discover anything new about the song by writing the book? Did something occur to you in all your research and just in the writing of it that you were like, oh, until I was putting it all down, this thing had never occurred to me?
Well, basically, those two things I've already mentioned. One, the blue eyes, and the other, and the blue eye happened at the beginning of writing a book because I had Toni Morrison, and the connection with the migrants, which happened after the book was already written and published in Italian. So it happened afterwards, and that happened not by listening to the song, but it was a photograph I saw of these African people on the boulders of the sea by the French-Italian border. I could see their eyes. They were all brown. And then I realized that they had come across crooked highways, and they were being surrounded by white men walking black dogs. So, yes, these were the 2 things. And basically, I guess the comparison with the folk ballad uh, helped help me understand the folk ballad better. Mm. You know, and in the book, the book is out in it's not a music series; it's an oral history series. So, which is why the meaning of history. It made me realize that ultimately, why does the lover, the true love, kill the young man? Because for the poor people who have kept this song alive for 5 centuries, and it's still being sung somewhere, mm-hmm. History was not the road to freedom that a lot of us tried. It was fraught with catastrophes, invasions, taxes, the privatization, appropriation of land, wars, conscription, bombardments, all these things. And the fact that they, the Blue-Eyed Boys' final message is, I'll help you see the state your world is in before it. The final message of the folk song is, history is a nightmare. However, we will not give up the future. So in a way, the vision of history is even more articulate in the folk song, but I had never thought of it in those terms until I started listening to it again along with Heart Rain.
Well, that's marvelous. That's really marvelous. Like I said, I really enjoyed the book. I found it fascinating, and again, you had insights to things that I'd never really appreciated before. And it's a great read. And so I absolutely implore anyone listening to this is a big Bob Dylan fan. That's why you're listening. So I would say go pick up Hard Rain, Bob Dylan, Oral Cultures, and the Meaning of History by Alessandro Portelli. You will thoroughly enjoy it. Alessandro, thank you so much for doing this. I feel like we could talk, another hour on Hard Rain. I mean, again, you wrote 150 plus pages on it, and an hour-long podcast is not enough. But thank you so much for doing this. Now, before we wrap up, I do have to ask you the standard exit question that I ask all of my guests. And I think I probably know the answer to it already based on what you've written, but I'll ask it anyway. If there is any album sessions of Bob's that you could sit in on, just you could go back in time and be a fly on the wall, what album would you want to sit in on? I'm imagining it's going to be this because you would get to see this song performed as you heard it, but what album would that be?
I don't know. My Bob Dylan imprinting was The Times Are Changing. So perhaps in terms of affection, I would probably pick that, not because it's better or more important, partly because I don't know it as well as I know Freewheeling. And
you'd get to hear When the Ship Comes In recorded. That would be big for you.
And you know what he says? He makes a comment. He says, back in the old days, Goliath was a powerful man, but he was slain. Today, we have even more Goliaths, but they will also be slain. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a message that I try to carry with me.
Again, thank you so much for doing this. I really enjoyed the book. It was great getting to talk to you about this song. And again, thank you so much. Now, of course, everybody, if you want to find back episodes of Pod Dylan, just go to our website, fireandwaterpodcast.com. You can subscribe to the show on any podcatcher of your choice. And we have to thank our Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/FW podcast. So big thanks to Robert Ward, Steve Cronin, Max Hutzel, George Doherty, Joaquin Meckel, Paul Ruther, and Henry Bernstein. Really appreciate the support. So again, Alessandro, thank you so much. Everybody, pick up the book, Hard Rain, Bob Dylan, Oral Cultures and the Meaning of History, and we will see you later. Bye.